The millionaire saw a mother with triplets shivering in the storm. Touched by their plight, he gave his entire mansion to the four of them. Months later, he returned to visit the house he had donated, and what he found inside left him pale with shock. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We'll continue. The rain lashed against the bulletproof windows of the Rolls-Royce as Richard Montgomery reviewed the latest reports. On his tablet, the raindrops slid down the window like silent tears, creating a translucent veil between him and the outside world. The traffic light turned red, forcing the vehicle to stop on one of New York's busiest avenues. The clock read 6:45 a.m. Like every day for the past 15 years, Richard followed his meticulously calculated routine. At 45, he had built an empire. From nothing, transforming himself into one of the country's most successful businessmen. His austere face and penetrating gaze revealed a personality shaped by discipline and absolute control over every aspect of his life. The driver, John, maintained a respectful silence as always. The relationship between the two was purely professional, but there was an unquestionable loyalty built over the years. John was one of the few employees who knew the true solitary nature of his employer. A sudden movement outside caught Richard's attention. Through the curtain of rain, his eyes found a scene that paralyzed him. A young woman, completely soaked, was hugging three small children. They were identical, triplets. She was trying to protect them with a thin coat that was visibly inadequate for that downpour. The children were trembling, their little faces marked by a mixture of fear and helplessness. Something in the desperate expression of the woman, in the way she tried to embrace all three at once, caused a crack in Richard's emotional armor. People passed by hurriedly, some bumping into the small group, others detouring with indifference. No one stopped. No one looked. "John, stop the car," ordered Richard, his normally controlled voice betraying a slight tremor. The driver, surprised by the break in routine, promptly obeyed. Richard opened the door, protecting himself with a black umbrella. He approached the group with firm steps, but his expression had changed. There was something different in his eyes, a long-forgotten vulnerability. "Ma'am," he called, his voice softer than usual. "Do you need help?" The woman raised her eyes, revealing a young face marked by fatigue and worry. Her dark brown hair stuck to her wet face, and her hands trembled as she held the children. "We're fine, thank you," she replied, with a dignity that contrasted with her precarious situation. Richard observed the children more carefully. They must have been about 4 years old, three identical boys with large, frightened eyes clinging to their mother's soaked skirt. Something about that scene transported him to a distant past, a time he struggled to keep locked away in some obscure place in his memory. "Please," he insisted, "let me help. I have a car here and can take you to a safe place until the rain passes." The woman hesitated, her gaze alternating between the well-dressed stranger and her children shivering with cold. One of the boys coughed, and that sound seemed to decide for her. "I'm Lucy," she introduced herself, still cautiously, "and these are Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael." Richard gestured toward the car where John was already waiting with the door open. "Richard Montgomery," he replied simply. "Let's get out of this rain first, then we can talk." As he helped Lucy and the children into the vehicle, Richard didn't notice the discreet flash of a camera going off from one of the windows of the building across the street. Nor did he notice the watchful eye of his housekeeper, Helen, who observed everything from her own apartment in the same building where he lived. The Rolls-Royce glided smoothly over the wet asphalt, carrying that impromptu group toward Richard's penthouse. In the back seat, the children gradually stopped shivering, their curious eyes exploring the luxurious interior of the vehicle. Lucy remained silent, but her eyes revealed a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. Richard observed the scene through the rearview mirror, feeling something strange in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. He couldn't name that feeling, but something told him that his life, so meticulously organized, was about to change forever. Richard's penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of one of New York's most exclusive buildings. The environment, decorated in shades of grey and white, reflected the personality of its owner, minimalist, organized, and impeccable. When the group entered, the contrast between the antiseptic luxury of the apartment and the soaked figures was striking. Helen, the housekeeper, who had worked for Richard for more than a decade, observed the scene with a mixture of surprise and distrust. In 15 years, she had never seen her boss bring unexpected visitors, much less an entire family. Something in her gaze betrayed that this break in the routine deeply disturbed her. "Helen, prepare towels and dry clothes for our guests," ordered Richard, his voice maintaining the professional tone of always, "and provide a hearty breakfast." The housekeeper nodded in silence, but her eyes lingered on Lucy for a few seconds longer than necessary. There was something calculating in her expression, as if she were assessing a potential threat. Lucy, still uncomfortable with the situation, tried to keep the triplets close. The boys, however, were already beginning to show curiosity about the new environment. Michael, the most observant of the three, couldn't take his eyes off Richard. Gabriel explored the space with his gaze, while Raphael, the shyest, remained glued to his mother. "You can use the guest room to change," indicated Richard, pointing to a hallway. "Helen will bring dry clothes in a moment." While Lucy and the children were led to the room, Richard headed to his office. He needed to reorganize his schedule. For the first time in years, he felt there was something more important than his morning meetings. Seated at his desk, he observed the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The rain continued to fall, creating hypnotic patterns on the glass. His cell phone vibrated. A message. Upon opening it, his body tensed instantly. It was a photo, taken a few minutes ago, showing Lucy and the triplets sitting on the sofa in his living room, wrapped in blankets that Helen had just provided. The caption was short but disturbing. "Do you know who they are?" Richard rose abruptly. The photo could only have been taken from inside the apartment. His security system was impenetrable, which meant that the person responsible had access to the place. The list of suspects was short, very short. At that moment, Helen entered the office without knocking, something she had never done before. "Mr. Montgomery, we need to talk." Her voice was laden with unusual urgency. Richard faced his housekeeper, noticing for the first time how her eyes seemed to know more than they showed. "Yes, Helen, we really do." "That woman," Helen began, but Richard interrupted her with a gesture. "First, I want you to explain this," he said, showing the photo on his cell phone. Helen's face paled for a second, but she quickly regained her composure. "Yes, I took the photo, and I did it for your own good, sir. You don't know these people. You don't know who they are or what they want." Richard felt a wave of anger growing in his chest, but he controlled it, as he always did with his emotions. "And you do?" "I know enough to worry," replied Helen, her voice taking on a protective tone that sounded almost maternal. "You built all this from scratch. You can't let—" A noise coming from the living room interrupted the conversation. It was the sound of children's laughter, a sound that had never echoed on those walls. Richard and Helen headed to the living room where they found a surprising scene. Raphael, the quietest triplet, was sitting at the grand piano that decorated the room, his small hands sliding over the keys with a natural curiosity. Lucy, now dressed in borrowed dry clothes, was trying to move the boy away from the instrument. "I'm sorry," she said, visibly embarrassed. "He has a fascination with music." Richard observed the scene, feeling that strange sensation in his chest again. "Let him," he said, surprising everyone, including himself. "The piano needs life. It has been still for too long." Helen watched everything with an increasingly concerned look. She had known her boss for enough years to realize that something was changing, and changes, in her experience, rarely brought anything good. At that moment, Richard didn't know it, but he was about to discover that that rainy morning was just the beginning of a story that would change not only his life, but that of everyone around him. And as the disorganized notes of the piano echoed through the penthouse, deeper mysteries began to form, like dark clouds on the horizon. Breakfast was served in the spacious dining room, where the tempered glass table reflected the soft light that was beginning to break through the clouds. Helen had prepared a veritable banquet: fresh bread, fruits, natural juices, eggs. and a variety of cheeses. The triplets, now dry and warm, looked in wonder at so much food. Richard, seated at the head of the table, discreetly observed as Lucy helped the boys serve themselves. There was a delicacy in her gestures, a particular attention to each child, even though they were identical. She knew their preferences, their small differences. Michael preferred fruit, cut into smaller pieces. Gabriel always asked for more juice, and Raphael, the quietest, would only eat if his mother tasted it first. "You were a lawyer," Richard suddenly said, breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. Lucy raised her eyes, surprised. "How did you know?" "Your posture, your way of speaking, the way you carefully—" "Choose your words," he replied, taking a sip of coffee. "And there's one detail. When you entered the apartment, your eyes immediately located the emergency exits. It's a common habit among legal professionals." A sad smile passed over Lucy's. "To us it was, yes, a long time ago, before the boys," Richard completed, maintaining a neutral tone. "Before everything changed," she replied, her gaze momentarily lost in memories that seemed too painful to share. Helen, who was serving more coffee, didn't disguise her interest in the conversation. Her attentive eyes registered every word, every gesture, as if assembling an invisible puzzle. "Mommy was the best," exclaimed Gabriel suddenly, surprising everyone. "Grandpa always said she would be a judge one day." Lucy's face visibly paled at the mention of Grandpa. Richard noticed the change in her expression, but before he could question it, Michael began coughing violently. The boy had choked on a piece of bread. Richard reacted instinctively, rising to help, but Helen was faster. With precise movements, she helped the boy recover. When everything calmed down, there was something different in the housekeeper's gaze, a flash of genuine emotion that contrasted with her usual reserve. "We need to go," said Lucy, getting up abruptly. "We've already abused your hospitality too much." "You have nowhere to go," Richard stated. Again, it wasn't a question. Lucy hesitated, her eyes meeting his. There was a silent confrontation there, pride against concern, distrust against need. "Stay," he said, surprising himself. "At least until you find a safe place." "Why are you doing this?" asked Lucy, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard stood up and walked to the window. The city stretched below, a labyrinth of buildings and avenues where thousands of stories unfolded simultaneously. Because 25 years ago, on a morning like this, no one stopped to help a boy who also had nowhere to go. The silence that followed his declaration was heavy, laden with unspoken meanings. Helen, who partially knew her employer's story, let out an almost inaudible sigh. "The guest room is yours for as long as you need it," continued Richard, still with his back to the group. "Helen will provide everything necessary." The housekeeper opened her mouth to protest, but a look from Richard silenced her. She nodded stiffly and left the room, her steps echoing on the marble floor. Raphael, who had been quiet until then, got up from his chair and walked over to Richard. To everyone's amazement, especially Lucy's, the boy held the businessman's hand. It was a simple gesture, almost imperceptible, but charged with inexplicable confidence. "Thank you," said the boy, his voice so low that only Richard could hear. At that moment, something inside the businessman, something he had buried decades ago beneath layers of success and self-discipline, began to move. It was as if a long-locked door was slowly beginning to open. On the other side of the city, in a luxurious office, a gray-haired man observed a computer screen. On it, a series of photos showed Lucy and the triplets entering Richard Montgomery's car. His eyes, cold as ice, narrowed as he picked up the phone. "I found them," he said simply, "and you won't believe where they are." The morning advanced, and with it, the gears of destiny began to move. In Richard's penthouse, among cups of coffee and hesitant smiles, no one realized they were being watched, and that very soon, the past that everyone was trying to leave behind would come to collect its price. The afternoon was falling over New York when Richard finally returned to his office in the penthouse. He had cancelled all the day's meetings, something unprecedented in his career. and dedicated the last few hours to making arrangements for his unexpected guests. Now seated in his Italian leather armchair, he tried to organize his thoughts while observing the city through the panoramic windows. The soft sound of knocking on the door interrupted his contemplation. It was Helen, carrying an old folder and a worried expression on her face. "Mr. Montgomery," she began, closing the door behind her, "there's something you need to see." Richard gestured for her to approach. Helen placed the folder on his desk and opened it, revealing a series of carefully preserved newspaper clippings. "I researched our guest," explained the housekeeper, her voice assuming a professional tone. "Lucy Mendez Almeida. She was a promising lawyer until 5 years ago when she married Edward Vance." The name made Richard raise his eyebrows. The Vance family was one of the most influential in the country, known both for their economic power and their political connections. "Edward was the youngest son of Augustus Vance," continued Helen, pointing to a newspaper photo that showed an elegant gray-haired man. "The patriarch of the family." "Was?" questioned Richard, noting the use of the past tense. Helen nodded gravely. "Edward suffered a car accident shortly after the triplets were born. Since then, Lucy disappeared from public life. There are rumors that Augustus Vance blames her for what happened, and..." A noise coming from the living room interrupted the conversation. It was the sound of the piano again, but this time the notes formed a recognizable melody, an old lullaby. Richard and Helen exchanged surprised looks before heading to the living room. They found Raphael sitting at the piano, his small hands moving with surprising dexterity over the keys. Lucy was by his side, her eyes watery, while Michael and Gabriel listened seated on the floor. "I'm sorry," said Lucy upon noticing their presence. "Edward used to play this song for them to sleep." Richard observed the scene with a strange feeling in his chest. "Did he teach them to play?" "No," replied Lucy, her voice choked. "Raphael learned on his own, listening to his father. He has a natural gift for music." Helen discreetly cleared her throat, drawing Richard's attention. There was more in the folder she had brought, more secrets to be revealed, but something in his gaze made her understand that it wasn't the time. The rest of the afternoon passed in an improvised routine. Helen, still visibly distrustful, but now with an almost maternal interest in the triplets, organized a snack and activities for the children. Richard tried to work in his office, but his thoughts kept returning to the family in his living room. It was already night when his cell phone vibrated with a message. It was from an unknown number, but the content made his blood freeze. "Get out of this story while you can, Montgomery. You don't know who you're dealing with." Almost simultaneously, he heard a scream coming from the guest room. He ran there, finding Lucy pale, holding an envelope that someone had slipped under the door. Inside it were old photos, Lucy with Edward, both smiling in front of a courthouse, the newborn triplets in the hospital, and a last image more recent showing Lucy and the children entering Richard's car that morning. "He found us," she whispered, trembling. "Augustus always finds us." Richard took the photos, studying them carefully. His analytical mind was already working on possible solutions, security measures, protection strategies. But there was something else, something he couldn't ignore. A protective instinct he hadn't felt since never. "No one is going to hurt you," he declared, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised even himself. "Not while you're under my protection." At that moment, Helen appeared at the door, her face tense. "Sir, there's something else you need to know about the Vances," she said hesitantly. "Something I found in the old company archives." Richard nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on Lucy and the children. The past and the present were about to collide, and he knew that the next few hours would be crucial. In the city below, lights were beginning to come on, like earthly stars guiding the way through the approaching darkness. Richard's office was immersed in twilight when Helen returned with an even older folder than the previous one, the yellowed. Paper and time stains revealed documents from at least 2 decades ago. The housekeeper placed the material on the desk with almost reverential care. "I found this in the old company archives," she began, her voice softer than usual. "These are records from when you were still building your empire. There's something here about the Vances that might explain a lot." Richard opened the folder cautiously. The first page was a partnership contract dated 20 years ago, signed by him and Augustus Vance. His hands trembled slightly as he recognized his own signature, so different from his current one. "I was his partner," Richard murmured, more to himself than to Helen. "For a brief period," confirmed the housekeeper, "before he tried to take control of the company you were building. It was your first great business battle." The memories began to return like flashes. Sleepless nights, piles of documents, tense meetings. Richard had managed to maintain control of his nascent company, but the emotional cost had been high. After that episode, he had closed himself off even more from the world, transforming his solitude into a fortress. "Augustus never forgave me for winning," observed Richard, leafing through more documents. "But that was so long ago." "There's more," interrupted Helen, pulling out a newspaper clipping. "Edward Vance, Lucy's husband, was a lawyer for your company at the time of the accident. He was investigating some irregularities in his own father's business." The weight of that revelation fell like an avalanche on Richard. His hands instinctively reached for the water bottle on the desk, but before he could reach it, he heard a child's voice from the door. "You knew my dad?" It was Michael, the most observant. 12 the Triplets, standing in the doorway with his large, curious eyes. Richard and Helen exchanged concerned looks, but before they could respond, Lucy appeared behind her son. "Michael, you shouldn't be here," she said softly, but her gaze was fixed on the document spread across the desk. "Your husband," began Richard, choosing his words carefully, "was a man of principles." Lucy approached, her eyes recognizing the old papers. "Edward always said there were too many secrets in the Vance family, dangerous secrets." "Mommy," called Michael, pulling at the hem of her blouse, "why doesn't Grandpa like it when you talk about Daddy?" The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Helen discreetly led Michael out of the office, leaving Richard and Lucy alone with the shadows of the past that were beginning to take shape. "Edward discovered something," said Lucy, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something about Augustus's business. He was gathering evidence, documents. Then that night," her voice failed, and Richard realized there was more to that story than he had imagined. The accident that took Edward's life might not have been just an accident. "Why did you never report it?" he asked, watching her carefully. "Because he has too much power," replied Lucy, her eyes filling with restrained tears, "and because he swore that if I tried anything, I would never see my children again." At that moment, a sound of breaking glass came from the living room, followed by the frightened cry of one of the children. Richard and Lucy ran out of the office, finding a disturbing scene. The large living room window was shattered, and in the middle of the glass shards was a stone with a note tied to it. Helen was already there, hugging Gabriel and Raphael, while Michael hid behind the piano. Richard picked up the note with steady hands, but his heart raced as he read the contents. "Last chance, Montgomery. Tomorrow may be too late." "How is this possible?" questioned Helen, her voice trembling for the first time in years. "We're on the 30th floor." Richard walked to the broken window, observing the night city below. Someone had managed to bypass his entire security system, someone with resources and determination. The war that had begun 20 years ago was about to restart, but now there was much more at stake. "Lucy," he called without turning around, "I need you to tell me everything. Every detail of what Edward discovered. I can't protect you if I don't know what we're fighting against." The cold night wind invaded the apartment through the broken window, making the curtains dance like ghosts. In the city below, lights blinked, like earthly stars, silent witnesses to a story that was beginning to reveal its deepest and darkest layers. Dawn was advancing as the security team finished installing temporary protection on the broken window. Richard had activated his best contacts, and in a matter of hours, the penthouse had transformed into a veritable fortress. Extra cameras were installed, motion sensors activated, and a private security team began monitoring every inch of the building. In the apartment's library, temporarily transformed into a meeting room, Lucy was seated in a leather armchair, her hands clutching a cup of tea that Helen had prepared. The Triplets were finally asleep in the guest room, exhausted after the scare. Edward began to suspect something was wrong about 6 years ago, began Lucy, her voice low but firm. He was responsible for the internal audit of Vance Enterprises. At first they were just small inconsistencies, numbers that didn't add up. Richard listened attentively, seated at his desk, while Helen took notes on an iPad. The housekeeper had transformed into an unexpected ally, her initial distrust replaced by an iron determination to protect the children. Then he discovered the offshore accounts, continued Lucy, millions being transferred to tax havens, shell. Companies inflated contracts, but the worst wasn't that. There were connections with powerful people, politicians, judges. That's why Augustus had so much power to threaten you, concluded Richard, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together. Edward kept everything on a flash drive, said Lucy, her voice trembling slightly. He gave it to me the night of the accident, saying it was life insurance for me and the children. Helen raised her eyes from the iPad, her expression suddenly alert. And where is this flash drive now? Before Lucy could answer, a soft sound came from the hallway. It was Raphael, standing in the doorway of the library in his new pajamas, hugging a teddy bear that Helen had found in an old cabinet. "Can't sleep, little one?" asked Richard, his tone surprisingly gentle. Raphael shook his head negatively and walked over to him. To everyone's astonishment, he climbed onto the businessman's lap as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Richard tensed for a moment but soon found himself relaxing with the weight of the child in his arms. "Will you protect us?" asked Raphael, his voice sleepy but clear. The question hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. It was the first time he had heard the boy's voice so distinctly, and there was something in that childish trust that broke his last barriers. "I will," he answered, with a certainty that came from the depths of his soul. "I promise." Lucy observed the scene with tears in her eyes, while Helen discreetly wiped her own. The moment was interrupted by Richard's cell phone, which vibrated with a message. It was a photo of the flash drive, accompanied by GPS coordinates and a message. "Come, alone, or the next photos will be less pleasant." Richard felt Raphael fall asleep in his arms as he studied the message. His analytical mind was already drawing up plans, calculating risks, considering alternatives. But there was something different now, a motivation that went beyond the cold logic of business. "Helen," he called softly, "prepare the master bedroom for Lucy and the children. It's safer than the guest room." The housekeeper nodded, understanding the strategy. The master bedroom had a hidden panic room equipped with everything necessary for an emergency. "And what about the flash drive?" asked Lucy, the concern evident in her voice. "Leave that to me," replied Richard, adjusting Raphael in his arms to take him back to bed. "I have some contacts who can help us without raising suspicions." As he walked down the hallway with the sleeping boy, Richard reflected on how his life had completely changed in less than 24 hours. His meticulous routine, his emotional walls, his self-imposed solitude, everything was being challenged by the presence of this unexpected family. In the bedroom, he found Michael and Gabriel also awake, waiting for their brother. As he placed Raphael in bed, he felt small hands holding onto his sleeve. "Stay a little longer?" asked Gabriel, his large, pleading eyes. Richard hesitated for a moment, years of emotional isolation fighting against something new growing in his chest. Then, for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to sit on the edge of the bed and began to tell a story, the same one he had heard long ago on an equally frightening night when he was just a boy in an orphanage. Morning arrived with a deceptive softness, the winter sun penetrating through the bulletproof windows of the penthouse. Richard had been in his office since the early hours, his eyes fixed on the computer screen as he coordinated a silent operation. His hands flew over the keyboard, activating contacts, moving resources, preparing for what was to come. Helen entered, without making a sound, carrying a tray with fresh coffee. Her experienced eyes immediately noticed the signs that her boss had not slept: the slightly loose tie, the slightly disheveled hair, the computer screen reflecting dozens of emails sent during the night. "The boys asked about you at breakfast," she said, her voice carrying a note of affection that surprised even herself. "Especially Raphael. He wanted to know if you would tell more stories." Richard paused his work for a moment, allowing himself a small smile. "How are they?" "Adapting surprisingly well," replied Helen, serving the coffee. "Michael has already discovered your library and is fascinated with the art books. Gabriel doesn't stop exploring the apartment, asking 1,000 questions about everything. And Raphael, well, he spends hours at the piano playing melodies that seem to come from nowhere." A familiar sound filled the air, as if to confirm Helen's words. It was Raphael at the piano, his small hands creating a melody that seemed to dance between sadness and hope. "He has an extraordinary gift," commented Richard, rising to observe the boy through the office door. "I need to arrange a music teacher for him." Helen raised her eyebrows, surprised by the long-term planning implicit in that statement. "You intend to keep them here for that long?" Before Richard could answer, Lucy appeared at the door, her eyes revealing that she too hadn't slept much. "May I come in?" Richard made an affirmative gesture, and Helen discreetly withdrew, not without first exchanging a meaningful look with her boss. "I found this morning," said Lucy, extending a yellowed envelope. "It was hidden inside the teddy bear that Raphael has been carrying." Richard opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter from Edward, dated the day of his accident, and a small golden key. "It's a key to a safe deposit box," explained Lucy, her voice trembling slightly. "Edward had a safe in the bank, but he never told me what he kept there. In the letter, he mentions that there is evidence that can change everything." Richard studied the key carefully. "Which bank?" "I don't know," replied Lucy, running her hands through her hair in a gesture of frustration. "Edward was very careful with sensitive information. He said that the less I knew, the safer I would be." The sound of the piano stopped abruptly, replaced by children's animated voices. Michael and Gabriel had joined their brother, and now the three were conversing in their particular language of triplets. "They are so similar," commented Richard, observing the children, "but so different at the same time. How do you manage to differentiate them so easily?" asked Lucy, genuinely curious. "Even my own family sometimes gets confused." Richard reflected for a moment. "Michael has an analytical look, always observing everything. Gabriel is pure energy, can't stay still. And Raphael, he lives in his own world of music and dreams." Lucy regarded him with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "You really see them, don't you, as individuals?" "Perhaps because I too was once an invisible child," he responded, almost without realizing it. The moment was interrupted by Helen, who returned hurriedly to the office. "Sir, there's something you need to see. On television." Richard turned. On the plasma TV on the wall, tuning into the news channel indicated by Helen. His heart froze at seeing the headline, "Businessman Richard Montgomery under investigation for suspected financial irregularities." The report showed old photos of him with Augustus Vance, suggesting an alleged criminal partnership that had been covered up for years. It was a carefully constructed story to appear true, mixing real facts with elaborate lies. "It's begun," murmured Richard, his mind already calculating the next move. "He's trying to discredit us before we can use the evidence from the safe." Lucy paled, understanding the implications. Edward predicted this. In the letter, he mentions that Augustus would try to destroy anyone who threatened to expose the truth. That moment, Michael entered the office carrying one of the books from the library. "Look what I found," he exclaimed, showing an old photo that had fallen from between the pages. The photo showed a group of children in front of an orphanage. Richard immediately recognized his own young face, but there was something else that caught his attention. In the background, partially visible, was a man he knew very well, Augustus Vance. "Impossible," he whispered, taking the photo with trembling hands. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together in a way he could never have imagined. Silence in the office was as dense as fog, while Richard studied the old photograph. His fingers traced the outlines of the figures, memories long buried emerging like bubbles in deep water. St. Francis Orphanage, where he spent part of his childhood, had been funded by the Vance Foundation, a detail that now took on an entirely new meaning. "Helen," he called without taking his eyes off the photo, "bring me all the records you can find about the Vance Foundation between 1990 and 1995. The housekeeper nodded and left quickly, while Lucy approached to examine the image. Edward once mentioned that Augustus had a special social project, something he kept secret even from his own children. "It wasn't a social project," replied Richard, his voice laden with a sudden and disturbing understanding. "It was a laboratory." Before he could elaborate, the sound of hurried footsteps came from the hallway. It was Gabriel, running toward the office with an expression of panic. "Raphael is gone," he exclaimed, breathless. "We were playing hide and seek, but we've looked everywhere." Richard felt his blood freeze in his veins. In seconds, the building's entire security system was activated. Cameras were checked, guards mobilized, every inch of the building methodically searched. "The hallway cameras," murmured Helen, who had returned with a folder of documents. "Show the last 2 hours." On the computer screen, the images revealed something disturbing. Raphael had entered the service elevator alone, apparently following the sound of music coming from somewhere. The elevator descended to the basement, where the camera caught only a shadow moving quickly before the image was interrupted. "Does he have the bear?" Richard suddenly asked, turning to Gabriel. The boy shook his head negatively. "He left it, in the living room near the piano." Richard ran to the living room, followed by everyone. The teddy bear was lying near the piano bench, as if it had been left in a hurry. He picked it up, examining it carefully until he found something sewn into the lining. A small paper with handwritten numbers. "These are coordinates," he said, recognizing the pattern, "and a safe deposit box number." "Edward's safe," exclaimed Lucy, understanding. "But how did Raphael—" "Ooh, it wasn't a coincidence," interrupted Richard, his hands already typing commands on his cell phone. "The bear, the music, everything was planned. Augustus knew the safe existed, but didn't have the key. Now he has something, more valuable." "My son," whispered Lucy, her voice breaking. Michael, who had been quiet until then, pulled on Richard's sleeve. "I know where he is," he said with surprising certainty. Everyone turned to the boy, who continued. "Raphael always follows the music, and yesterday when we were exploring the building, we heard a piano coming from the banquet hall in the basement." "It's a trap," warned Helen, but Richard was already moving. "Of course it is," he replied, grabbing his phone. "That's why we're not going alone." With a few quick commands, he activated his private security team and made a call to someone he kept in reserve for extreme situations, a former federal agent who owed him favors. "Lucy, you and Michael stay here with Helen," he instructed, his voice not admitting arguments. "Gabriel comes with me." "Why?" questioned Lucy, protesting. "Because Raphael trusts Gabriel more than any of us," explained Richard. "If he's frightened, he'll need his brother." As the elevator descended to the basement, Richard held Gabriel's hand firmly. The boy, surprisingly calm, looked up with complete confidence in his eyes. "You'll bring him back, right?" asked Gabriel. "Aye." "Will," replied Richard, and for the second time that day he made a promise he intended to keep at any cost. The elevator stopped, and the doors opened to the dimness of the basement. From somewhere came the soft sound of a piano, the same melody that Raphael used to play, but there was something different about it, something metallic and artificial. Richard squeezed Gabriel's hand lightly, a gesture of mutual reassurance. Together they took the first step out of the elevator toward the sound that was calling them, while the shadows of the past and present mingled in the damp air of the basement. The banquet hall in the basement was a spacious and elegant area, normally used for sophisticated events. That morning, however, the environment had something surreal about it. The piano music echoed off the mirrored walls, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. Richard and Gabriel advanced cautiously, their shadows infinitely multiplied by the mirrors. "Raphael," called Gabriel, his childish voice breaking the hypnotic enchantment of the melody. The sound of the piano stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, they could hear soft footsteps coming from the back of the hall. A figure emerged from the dimness. It wasn't Raphael but Helen, her expression a mask of guilt and determination. "I'm sorry, Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I had no choice. Richard instinctively placed Gabriel behind him. Where is Raphael? He's safe, replied a deep and familiar voice. Augustus Vance emerged from behind one of the pillars, his impeccable suit contrasting with the hard expression on his aged face. As he has always been under my care. Your care? Questioned Richard, his mind quickly connecting the pieces of the puzzle. Like I was at the orphanage? Augustus smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. You were always the brightest of them, Richard, the most successful project of the Foundation. Gabriel squeezed Richard's hand harder, while Helen moved uncomfortably beside Augustus. The orphanage was an experiment, continued Vance, walking through the hall as if giving a lecture. We selected children with extraordinary potential, shaped their talents, created successors. Guinea pigs, corrected Richard, his voice laden with contained anger. We were guinea pigs for your manipulations. You should be grateful, retorted Augustus. I transformed you into what you are today, just as I was transforming my grandson Raphael. The revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. The aptitude tests at the orphanage, the piano. You were recreating the experiment with him. Raphael has an extraordinary gift, said Augustus, a flash of genuine pride crossing his expression. As you had for business, Edward never understood the importance of what we were doing. He wanted to expose everything, destroy decades of research. Where is my son? Interrupted a firm voice. Lucy was standing at the entrance to the hall, her eyes flashing with fury. Beside her, Michael held a tablet, his small hands trembling slightly. Mrs. Vance, began Augustus, but Lucy cut him off. Don't use that name, she said, advancing. Not after what you did to Edward. Helen moved restlessly, her eyes alternating between Richard and Augustus. Mr. Montgomery, there's something you need to know. He already knows, interrupted Michael, his voice surprisingly mature for his age. Dad left everything recorded. The boy turned the tablet, showing a video. It was Edward Vance, recorded on the night of his accident. His voice filled the hall. If something happens to me, look for Richard Montgomery. He is living proof of what my father did. He and the other children of Project Prometheus. Augustus visibly paled. How? The bear, explained Michael. It didn't just have the safe key. It had a flash drive sewn inside it. Raphael discovered it last week but didn't know what it was. He just followed the music. Richard felt a wave of understanding hit him. Raphael hadn't been taken. He had been lured using the same method that Augustus used at the orphanage to identify children with special talents. Helen, called Richard, without taking his eyes off Augustus. You don't owe him anything. The housekeeper stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. He threatened my family, my daughter. Like he threatened mine, completed Lucy. Like he manipulated everyone around him, Augustus. But now it's over. A soft sound of piano began to play again, coming from an adjacent room. It was no longer the artificial melody. They were the pure, crystalline notes that only Raphael could create. He's here, whispered Gabriel, pulling Richard's hand toward the sound. Augustus made a move to move, but Helen, in a sudden movement, blocked his path. Enough, she said, her voice firm despite the tears. I won't participate in this anymore. Richard and Gabriel ran toward the music, followed by Lucy and Michael. Behind them they could hear Augustus's voice shouting something, but the sound of the piano overlaid everything, like a beacon guiding them through the darkness of the past toward a light that was beginning to shine on the horizon. In a smaller room, adjacent to the main hall, they found Raphael sitting at the piano, his fingers dancing over the keys with the same naturalness as always. He showed no fear or anxiety. He was completely immersed in his music, creating a melody that seemed to weave its own story. Raphael, called Lucy, running to embrace her son. The boy smiled, without stopping playing. I knew you would find me, he said simply. The music always shows the way. Michael and Gabriel joined their brother on the piano bench, forming a small circle of protection around him. Richard observed the scene with a mixture of relief and growing understanding. The music had been both a trap and a salvation, exactly as it had been in his own childhood at the orphanage. "The children of Project Prometheus," he said, more to himself than to the others. "Each with a specific gift: music, mathematics, strategy." "Edward discovered everything," confirmed Lucy, still embracing her children. "The files, the experiments, the selected children. Augustus was recreating the project with a new generation." Helen appeared at the door, her posture now firmer now that she had chosen her side. "The police are on their way," she informed. "Them. And I brought this." She extended an old folder, its pages yellowed by time. It was an orphanage file containing detailed photos and reports about each child in the project. Richard recognized his own record. Subject 23. Exceptional. Capacity for strategic analysis and leadership. "You were his pride," said Helen softly. "That's why he was so furious when you turned against him 20 years ago. His most successful project became his greatest threat." Raphael stopped playing, turning to Richard with his curious eyes. "Did you hear the music too?" Richard knelt beside the piano, getting down to the boy's eye level. "In a different way," he replied. "Each of us heard something unique. That's how he found us, tested us." "But the music isn't his," interrupted Raphael, with the disconcerting wisdom of a child. "The music is ours." At that moment, the sound of sirens began to echo through the building. Richard's security team had already contained Augustus in the main hall, and now the authorities would take over the case. Years of manipulation and secret experiments would finally come to light. "What happens now?" asked Michael, always the most pragmatic of the triplets. Richard exchanged a look with Lucy before answering. "Now you're safe. All of us are." "Can we keep living in the penthouse?" asked Gabriel hopefully. "There's much more space to play there." A genuine smile illuminated Richard's face. "If your mother agrees." Lucy observed her sons, Michael with his analytical gaze, Gabriel with his tireless energy, and Raphael with his unique musical gift. Each of them special in their own way, but not as part of an experiment. Special simply for being who they were. "I think we can consider that," she replied, smiling too. Helen discreetly cleared her throat. "I'll need help reorganizing the apartment for 5 people," she commented, her practical tone barely disguising the affection in her voice. Raphael turned back to the piano, playing some soft notes. The melody was different now, no longer Augustus's hypnotic call, but something new, something that spoke of new beginnings and possibilities. Richard felt something in his pocket, the old orphanage photo that Michael had found. Looking at it now, he no longer saw just the shadows of the past. He saw a reminder of how the most difficult circumstances can lead us to the most meaningful encounters. Outside, the city continued its frantic rhythm, indifferent to the small drama unfolding in the basement of one of its many skyscrapers. But inside that room, to the sound of Raphael's piano, a new family was beginning to form, not through experiments or manipulation, but through choice, through care, through love. The music continued, and now it was a melody of liberation, the Sioux. Following weeks brought significant changes to Richard Montgomery's penthouse. What was once a space marked by meticulous order and silence now pulsed with a different energy. The once empty corridors echoed with children's laughter, animated conversations, and, of course, the constant music of the piano. Helen had dedicated herself to transforming the apartment with surprising enthusiasm. The guest room was converted into a cheerful space for the triplets, with 3 beds strategically arranged, Michael near the bookshelf, Gabriel close to the window with a view of the city, and Raphael next to a digital keyboard that Richard had bought especially for him. On that particular morning, Richard observed from his office as Lucy helped the boys with their new routines. She had resumed her law license and begun working part-time in the legal department of Richard's company, balancing her return to the profession with caring for her children. "The piano teacher will arrive in half an hour," reminded Helen, entering the office with a cup of coffee. "And the investigator is waiting on line 3. Richard nodded, picking up the phone. The investigations into Project Prometheus were advancing, revealing a complex network of influence and manipulation that stretched back decades. Each new discovery helped explain more about his own past and that of other children who had passed through the orphanage. "Montgomery," he said into the phone, his professional voice masking the inner tension. "We found more files," reported the voice. On the other end, there were other orphanages, other similar projects. The reach was greater than we imagined. Richard made some notes while listening to the report. In the background, he could hear Raphael practicing his scales on the piano, a routine the boy had established on his own without any imposition. "And what about the other children?" he asked, thinking of the faces in the old photograph. "We're locating each one of them. Some have become prominent figures in their fields, scientists, artists, business leaders, all shaped by the program, like you." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was Michael, carrying a book almost bigger than himself. "Uncle Richard," he called. The title had emerged naturally in recent weeks. "Can you help me with this? It's about architecture, and there are some words I don't understand." "I'll call you back," Richard told the investigator, hanging up the phone. "Come here, Michael. What words are those?" The boy settled into one of the office armchairs, opening the book with reverent care. His interest in architecture had revealed itself in recent weeks, especially after discovering Richard's extensive collection of books on the subject. "Art Deco," read Michael, furrowing his brow. "And there's this other one, modernism." Richard began to explain the terms, using elements of his own office as examples. Helen, who observed the scene from the doorway, smiled discreetly before withdrawing. In the hallway, she found Gabriel organizing a kind of art exhibition with drawings made by the three brothers. The boy had developed a natural talent for curation, deciding exactly where each work should go to tell a coherent story. "It's looking beautiful," complimented Helen, helping him align one of the drawings. "It's for Mom," explained Gabriel. "She's been sad looking at the news about Grandpa, so I thought I'd do something to cheer her up." Helen felt her heart tighten. News about Augustus Vance and Project Prometheus had dominated the newspapers in recent weeks. Although Lucy tried to protect the boys from the heavier information, it was impossible to completely hide the impact the revelations had on the entire family. In the living room, Lucy was on the phone with her former professor from law school, discussing the possibility of teaching in a social project for underprivileged children, a way to transform her own experience into something positive for others. Raphael, who had taken a break from his practice, sat next to his mother with his music notebook. He had begun to create his own compositions, small melodies that seemed to capture the essence of the moments they were living. "This one is for Uncle Richard," he said, showing a score with his childish handwriting. "It's called New Family." Lucy hugged her son, moved by the sensitivity he demonstrated. The last few weeks had been intense, with police statements, meetings with lawyers, and a flood of painful memories being relived. But amid all this turmoil, something beautiful and unexpected had blossomed. From his office, Richard could hear the conversation while continuing to explain architectural concepts to Michael. His meticulously planned routine had been completely transformed, and surprisingly, he didn't miss the old order. He had discovered that there were other types of order, other rhythms of life that could be equally meaningful. The sound of the piano resumed, Raphael now playing his new composition. The melody was simple but profound, carrying in its notes the story of how strangers can become family, of how the wounds of the past can be healed by the care of the present. Autumn came, to New York bringing winds of change. The penthouse, once a space of calculated solitude, had been transformed into a true home. The walls that once reflected only Richard's professional success now displayed the children's drawings, photographs of shared moments, and even some music, scores composed by Raphael. On that specific afternoon, the living room had been transformed into a small improvised auditorium. It was the day of Raphael's first performance with his piano teacher, an event that had mobilized the entire family. Helen had organized a small cocktail party. Michael had helped arrange the chairs in a semicircle, and Gabriel had insisted on creating handmade invitations for each guest. "Nervous?" asked Richard, finding Raphael practicing his last notes before the presentation. The boy shook his head negatively. "The music is already in here," he replied, touching his own chest. "I just need to let it out." Richard smiled, recognizing in that childish wisdom something he himself was learning. Sometimes the greatest truths come from the most unexpected sources. Lucy entered the room, elegantly dressed for the occasion. In recent weeks, she had regained not only her professional confidence, but also a serenity that seemed to have been lost for a long time. "The first guests are arriving," she announced, adjusting the bow tie that Raphael had insisted on wearing. "And there's a special surprise." Through the main door entered several people whom Richard recognized from old orphanage photos. They were other products of Project Prometheus, each carrying their own story of overcoming. There was a famous violinist, an award-winning mathematician, an internationally recognized visual artist, all connected by the same dark past, but now gathered to celebrate something new. "You found them," Richard said to Helen, who observed the scene with evident satisfaction. "Actually, they found us," replied the housekeeper. "After the story came to light, many wanted to establish contact. I thought it would be appropriate for today." Michael and Gabriel circulated among the guests, clearly fascinated by the stories each had to tell. The mathematician showed number tricks to Michael, while the artist discussed color techniques with Gabriel. "It's strange," commented Lucy, standing next to Richard, "how something so dark can lead to such luminous moments." "Sometimes we need darkness to recognize light," he replied, surprising himself with his own philosophy. The piano teacher arrived, and everyone took their places. Raphael sat at the piano with a composure surprising for his age. His small hands rested on the keys, and for a moment there was an expectant silence. The music that began to flow was his own composition, New Family, now arranged with the help of his teacher. The notes told a story that everyone there could understand, a story of losses and encounters, of pain and healing, of solitude and connection. Richard observed the faces around him as the music filled the environment. He saw tears in the eyes of some of the former orphans, smiles on the faces of Michael and Gabriel, pride in Lucy's countenance. Helen, discreet as always, had a special sparkle in her eyes. Raphael's music was like an invisible thread connecting everyone present, transforming a group of strangers united by a painful past into a new form of family, a chosen family, built on understanding and mutual acceptance. When the last notes dissipated in the air, there was a moment of reverent silence before the applause began. Raphael stood up and made a small bow, exactly as his teacher had taught him, but his eyes sought first Richard and Lucy, seeking their approval. What he found was much more than that. It was the look of people who had learned that family is not just a matter of blood or documents, but of daily choices, of small gestures of care, of shared music and interwoven stories. "Now yes," whispered Raphael, sitting back at the piano for an encore, "it's complete." And as a new melody began to be born under his fingers, Richard realized that the boy was right. His life, which for so long had been an incomplete symphony, finally found its perfect harmony. The New York. Winter brought with it a soft mist that enveloped the skyscrapers like a silver mantle. In the penthouse, the aroma of hot chocolate prepared by Helen mingled with the sound of the triplets' laughter, who played in the living room, transformed into a fort of pillows. Richard observed the scene from his favorite armchair, a forgotten book in his lap. In recent weeks, his business empire had faced significant challenges due to the revelations about Project Prometheus, but surprisingly, that seemed less important now. "Still working on the reports?" asked Lucy, sitting in the armchair beside him. She had just returned from the courthouse where she now worked on cases related to children's and adolescents' rights. "Actually, I was thinking about something different," replied Richard, his eyes fixed on the boys. "I've been talking with some of the other survivors of the project. We want to create a foundation." Lucy leaned in, interested. "What kind of foundation?" One that does the opposite of what Augustus did, he explained. Instead of manipulating talents for personal benefit, we want to identify children with special gifts and give them and their families the support needed to develop naturally. In the center of the room, Raphael had left the play to sit at the piano. His small hands began to play a new melody, something that seemed to perfectly match the welcoming atmosphere of that winter afternoon. "It's a wonderful idea," said Helen, who was approaching with a tray of hot chocolate. "And I think we already have our first case studies." Michael looked up from the architecture book he was leafing through. "Can we help other children like us?" "What do you mean, like us?" asked Gabriel, joining the conversation. "Special," replied Michael with simplicity, "but special in our own way, not in the way Grandpa wanted." Richard felt something tighten in his chest. The wisdom of that 5-year-old child was disconcerting. "How exactly, Michael? Each person is special in their own way." Lucy observed her children with watery eyes. In recent weeks, they had flourished in unexpected ways. Michael was increasingly interested in architecture and design, spending hours drawing plans for imaginary houses. Gabriel had revealed a natural talent for visual arts, transforming the walls of his room into a constantly evolving gallery. And Raphael, well, his music spoke for itself. "I already have a name for the foundation," said Richard, taking his cup of hot chocolate. "Project Phoenix." "Because it's about rising from the ashes?" asked Helen, a small smile on her lips. "Because it's about transforming pain into possibility," he corrected gently. Raphael stopped playing for a moment, turning on the piano bench. "Can I compose music for the foundation?" "Of course you can," replied Richard. "In fact, I was thinking of starting with a cultural center, a place where children can explore music, art, science, anything that fascinates them." "In the old orphanage?" suggested Lucy, immediately understanding the symbolism. Richard nodded. "The building has been abandoned for years. We can transform it into something new, something good." Michael was already running to get his sketchbook. "Can I do the design?" "Well, try at least." "I'll help with the decoration," exclaimed Gabriel, his eyes shining with ideas. Helen observed everything with a satisfied smile. In recent months, she had witnessed the complete transformation not only of the apartment, but of all the people who lived there. The lonely and controlling man who was her boss had become someone capable of smiling, of playing, of loving. "You know what's most amazing?" she commented, helping Gabriel organize his colored pencils. "How sometimes the worst experiences can lead us to the best places." Richard looked around the room, at Michael concentrated on his architectural sketches, at Gabriel planning his next artwork, at Raphael returning to playing the piano, at Lucy smiling with a piece that seemed impossible a few months ago. "It's not the places," he replied, his voice soft. "It's the people we meet along the way." Raphael's music filled the environment again, a melody that seemed to carry in its notes the entire story of that improvised family. Outside, the mist was beginning to dissipate, revealing a surprisingly blue sky for a winter day in New York. Spring arrived in New York, bringing with it renewed energy. The old orphanage, now under full renovation, was beginning to take on new life under Richard's attentive supervision and the Triplets' enthusiastic collaboration. The grey walls that had once witnessed so many manipulations were now dressed in vibrant colors, carefully chosen by Gabriel. On that particular morning, the entire family had gathered at the site to monitor the progress of the construction. Michael walked through the corridors with a simplified floor plan in his hands, checking if each space corresponded to his childish but surprisingly accurate vision. "The music studio will be here," he explained, pointing to a spacious room. "Raphael said it needs good acoustics." Richard observed with admiration how the boy had absorbed architectural terms and concepts in such a short time. "And have you decided where the art gallery will be?" "Gabriel wants it to be near the garden," replied Michael, consulting his notes. "He says natural light is important for colors." Lucy, who had just arrived from a meeting with other volunteer lawyers for the project, smiled at seeing her sons so involved. She herself was coordinating the legal part of the foundation, ensuring that all children who would benefit from the program had their rights fully protected. "Helen called," she said to Richard. 3 more families from Project Prometheus made contact. They want to participate in the foundation." Richard nodded, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and responsibility. What had begun as a form of personal redemption was transforming into a larger movement, uniting people who shared not only a painful past, but also the desire to transform it into something positive. In the building's inner courtyard, Raphael was sitting on an improvised bench, composing in his music notebook. Beside him, a group of neighborhood children, who had already discovered that something special was happening there, watched, fascinated. "Can you teach us to play?" asked one of the girls. Raphael raised his eyes from his score, smiling. "When the studio is ready, everyone will be able to learn," he replied, his voice soft but confident. Helen, who had arrived bringing snacks for everyone, stopped to observe the scene. "He's becoming more and more communicative," she commented. To Richard, "Everyone is changing," he replied, "including me." Indeed, Richard's transformation was visible to anyone who had known him before. The man who once measured each minute of his day and calculated each human interaction now allowed himself moments of spontaneity, of affection, of simplicity. Gabriel approached running, his hands stained with paint. "Uncle Richard, come see. I finished the entrance mural." The mural was an explosion of colors and shapes that somehow told the story of the foundation. There were elements representing music, architecture, art, and science, all intertwined in a composition that, although created by childish hands, carried a surprising depth. "It's about transformation," explained Gabriel, pointing to different parts of the mural, like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, or like a lonely man turning into family, Lucy added softly, intertwining her fingers with Richard's. The moment was interrupted by sounds of laughter and music. Raphael had begun to play on a portable keyboard, and the neighborhood children danced around him. Michael joined the group, excitedly explaining how that space would transform into a school of arts, while Gabriel was already planning his next work. "You know what's most incredible?" said Helen, observing the scene. "How love can change not only the future, but also the past." Richard understood exactly what she meant. The painful memories of the orphanage, Augustus's manipulations, all the suffering, none of it had disappeared, but now these experiences served as a foundation for something new and beautiful. "Edward would be proud," said Lucy, her voice choked with emotion. "He always said that the true legacy he wanted to leave for the boys was the ability to transform the world." "And they are doing exactly that," replied Richard, "each in their own way." Raphael's music floated through the courtyard, mixing with the sounds of renovation, with the children's laughter, with the rustling of new leaves on the garden trees. It was a symphony of new beginnings, of hope, of family. On one of the upper floors, Michael had found a perfect location for what he called the dream room, a space where other children could discover and develop their own talents, not through manipulation or pressure, but with freedom and support. The day of the Phoenix Cultural Center's inauguration dawned with an extraordinarily blue sky. The old orphanage, completely renovated, shone under the sunlight, its once grey walls now alive with Gabriel's murals and those of other young artists from the community. Richard adjusted his tie in front of the mirror in his bedroom at the penthouse while listening to the animated buzz coming from the living room. The last few months had been intense, with the building's renovation, the structuring of the foundation, and, most importantly, the adaptation to a life that now overflowed, with affection and meaning. "Nervous?" asked Helen, entering the room with a bow tie for Raphael. "Curious," he replied, smiling slightly. "I never imagined I would be doing something like this." In the hallway, the triplets were already ready, each in his own particular way. Michael wore a miniature suit that he himself had chosen, with a notepad in his pocket, to record all the details of the day. Gabriel had opted for more artistic attire, with a colorful vest that matched the main mural of the cultural center. Raphael, elegant in his formal outfit, held a folder with scores. He would be one of the main attractions of the inauguration ceremony. "Mom looks beautiful," announced Gabriel, running down the hallway. Lucy emerged from her room wearing a navy blue dress that enhanced her natural elegance. In recent months, she had become not only a partner in the foundation, but a fundamental presence in Richard's life. Their relationship had evolved naturally, like a melody that had always existed, but only now found its complete expression. "The first guests are already arriving," informed Helen, consulting her tablet. "And the press is in position." The inauguration of the Phoenix Cultural Center had attracted considerable media attention, not only for the transformation of the old orphanage, but mainly for the story behind the project. Several former participants of Project Prometheus would be present, each bringing their own contribution to the new endeavor. "Uncle Richard," called Raphael, his voice soft but determined, "can I show you something before we go?" Richard followed, the boy to the living room piano. Raphael sat at the instrument and began to play a new composition. It was different from anything he had created until then, a complex piece that seemed to tell the entire story of that improvised family, from the rainy encounter to that moment. "It's to play at the inauguration," explained Raphael. "I called it Metamorphosis." Lucy, who had approached to listen, had tears in her eyes. "It's perfect, my love. It has parts for all of us," continued Raphael, pointing to different sections of the score. "This stronger part is Uncle Richard, before he found us. Then it gets softer but also more complex." Michael and Gabriel joined their brother on the piano bench, each recognizing the elements that represented their own stories in the composition. Helen observed the scene with an emotional smile, remembering how that penthouse, once so silent, had been transformed into a true home. "It's time," she announced softly, not wanting to interrupt the moment, but aware of the schedule. The group descended to the building's lobby, where an executive van awaited them. During the journey to the cultural center, Richard observed the city through the window, recalling that rainy morning that had changed everything. How was it possible that only a few months separated him from that lonely and controlling man he used to be? Upon arriving at the cultural center, they were received by a small crowd. Children from the neighborhood, who had already enrolled in the first courses offered, waved animatedly. Several of the former orphans from Project Prometheus, now successful adults, conversed among themselves, sharing stories and plans for the future. The building, with its historic architecture, preserved but renovated, seemed to pulse with possibilities. Each space had been carefully planned to nurture natural talents without ever forcing them. The library, the music studio, the art and science rooms, everything was ready to receive a new generation of dreamers. "Look!" exclaimed Gabriel, pointing to the sky. A small rainbow had formed, even without rain, creating a colorful arc above. "The building." "It's a sign," said Michael, always the most analytical, "that we're on the right path." Richard felt Raphael's small hand hold his, while Lucy intertwined her fingers on the other side. Helen, a few steps behind, smiled with maternal approval. Together they walked toward the entrance of the cultural center, where a new story was about to begin. The Phoenix Cultural Center's auditorium was full, a sea of attentive and expectant faces. On stage, Richard remained silent for a moment, observing the diverse audience that had gathered for the inauguration. There were children from the neighborhood, entire families, journalists, authorities, and most significantly, several former participants of Project Prometheus. "A year ago," he began, his voice firm but laden with emotion, "I believed that success meant control, that power meant isolation, that security meant distance. I was completely wrong." His eyes found Lucy in the first row, seated between Michael and Gabriel. Raphael was close to the piano on the stage, waiting for his moment to play. This cultural center is born not only as an institution of education and development, but as a testimony that the most painful stories can be transformed into something beautiful, that the traumas of the past can become bridges to a better future. In the audience, Helen discreetly wiped away a tear while observing the emotional expressions of the other former orphans. Each of them carried their own scars from Project Prometheus, but now those marks served as maps to help others find their own paths. "Each room in this building," continued Richard, "was designed to nurture natural talents, not to force them, to celebrate differences, not to standardize them, to build bridges, not walls." Michael flipped through his notebook, where he had recorded each step of the building's transformation. Gabriel proudly admired the murals that decorated the walls, each telling a different part of the story. And Raphael, seated at the piano, patiently awaited his moment to give voice to all of that through music. "But the real transformation," proceeded Richard, "is not in these renovated walls or in the programs we will develop. It's in the connections we create, in the families we form, in the bonds we build when we allow ourselves to be touched by the lives of others." Lucy smiled, remembering that rainy morning that had changed everything. How could she have imagined, in that moment of despair, that she was walking toward her salvation? "And now," said Richard, his gaze softening, "I would like to introduce someone who has taught me more about music, love, and courage than any book or course ever could. Raphael?" The boy stood up and walked to the piano with serene confidence. His small hands rested on the keys, and the first chords of Metamorphosis filled the auditorium. The music began with deep and solitary notes, portraying the isolation that both Richard and Lucy had lived. Gradually, new elements were introduced: the joyful voices of the triplets, the constant presence of Helen, the small moments of discovery and connection. The audience listened in reverent silence, many with tears in their eyes, recognizing, in each note, their own journeys of transformation. The neighborhood children, seated in the front rows, watched fascinated how someone as young as they could create something so profound. When the last chord sounded, there was a moment of absolute silence before the applause began. Raphael stood up and made a small bow, his eyes seeking first his family, all of them, those of blood and those that destiny had brought. Richard returned to the microphone for the final words. "This cultural center is open not only for classes, hand activities, but for dreams, for possibilities, for new beginnings." Michael and Gabriel ran to the stage, joining their brother. Lucy and Helen followed them, and for a moment everyone was together under the stage lights, an improvised family that had become more real than any traditional arrangement. Outside, the city continued its frantic rhythm, but within those renovated walls, something special had begun. The old shadows of Project Prometheus had been transformed into light, fears into hope, solitude into connection. And as people began to explore the facilities of the cultural center, Richard observed everything with a new understanding. True, power wasn't in control or isolation, but in the ability to open oneself to the unexpected, to allow love to transform not only the future, but also heal the past. Raphael returned to the piano, this time accompanied by other curious children, eager to learn. His music continued to fill the environment, no longer a solitary melody, but part of a greater symphony, the symphony of intertwined lives, of open hearts, of possible futures. 6 months after the inauguration of the Phoenix Cultural Center, life had found a new rhythm. Richard's penthouse, once a monument to organized solitude, now pulsed with a different energy on Sunday mornings. The aroma of fresh coffee and homemade bread prepared by Helen mingled with the sound of Raphael's piano, who practiced for his first formal presentation as a music teacher at the Cultural Center. "I can't believe he's going to teach," commented Lucy, observing her youngest son with pride as she served breakfast. "It seems like it was just yesterday that he could barely speak to strangers." Richard smiled, lowering the newspaper he was reading. The headlines were no longer about scandals or investigations, but about the success of the Phoenix Cultural Center's artistic development program. "He's not the only one who is surprising," he said, pointing to a specific page in the newspaper. In the culture section, there was an article about the center's first children's art exhibition, organized by Gabriel. The boy had not only curated the exhibition, but also helped other young artists find their own creative voices. His works, displayed side by side with those of other neighborhood children, told stories of transformation and hope. Michael entered the room carrying his latest creation, a detailed model of a new space he had designed for the cultural center. "We can build a special area for astronomy," he explained, his eyes shining with enthusiasm, "with a small observatory." Helen, who had just brought another batch of bread, examined the model with genuine interest. "You've thought of everything, haven't you? You even put access ramps and natural lighting." "I learned from the best," replied Michael, casting an affectionate look at Richard. The moment was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. It was Clara, one of the former participants of Project Prometheus, now a renowned scientist who had become a volunteer at the Cultural Center. She brought news about a special program they were developing. Registrations for the mentoring program have already exceeded our expectations, she announced, accepting a cup of coffee. We have more than 50 former project participants wanting to help other children develop their talents naturally, Richard observed as Clara showed the preliminary reports. The mentoring program was a crucial part of the foundation, connecting adults who had survived Project Prometheus with children who demonstrated similar talents. But unlike the past, the focus now was on healthy development and emotional support. Just look at this, said Clara, showing some photographs on her tablet. These are from our first science workshop. The photos showed children of different ages conducting experiments, their faces illuminated by discovery. In one of them, Michael appeared explaining basic architectural concepts to a group of interested young people. And it's not just in science, she continued. Raphael's music program already has a waiting list, and Gabriel's art classes. She was interrupted by the sound of the piano. Raphael had begun to play a new composition. The melody was different from anything he had created before, more mature and complex, but still carrying that emotional purity that characterized him. This is new, commented Lucy, approaching the piano. Does it have a name? Raphael continued playing as he answered. It's called Horizons. It's about how the future is always changing, always surprising us. Gabriel, who had been quietly drawing in his corner, stood up to show his newest work, a drawing that perfectly captured the present moment. The family gathered at breakfast, the sunlight entering through the windows, the piano in the background, each person in their own activity, but all connected by invisible bonds of affection. Can we hang it at the Cultural Center? He asked. In the Gallery of New Stories? Gallery of New Stories? Questioned Clara, curious. It's a special space, explained Michael, always ready to share information. For works that show how people can change, grow, find new paths. Helen, who observed everything with her ever-attentive gaze, noticed how Richard and Lucy had naturally moved closer, their hands finding each other without them realizing it. It was a small but significant gesture, a symbol of how love can flourish in the most unexpected places. You know, said Clara, preparing to leave, when you first proposed transforming the old orphanage into a cultural center, many doubted. They thought it was impossible to transform a place with so many painful memories into something positive. And what do they say now? Asked Richard, although he already knew the answer. Now they understand, she replied, smiling. Sometimes you need to revisit the past not to be stuck in it, but to create a different future. Raphael finished his music with a soft chord that seemed to hover in the air like a promise. The Sunday sun continued to bathe the room with its golden light, while the city outside began to awaken. It was a new day, with new horizons opening, not just for that improvised family, but for all the lives they were helping to transform. Night was gently falling over New York when Richard found the envelope on his desk in the penthouse office. It was a simple paper, but the content made his heart race, a summons to testify in the case against Augustus Vance. After months of investigations, the case would finally reach the courts. Did you receive yours too? Asked Lucy, entering the office. She carried her own envelope identical to his. Just opened it, replied Richard, his voice calm, masking the storm of emotions he felt. How are the boys? Raphael is at the Cultural Center giving his piano lesson. Michael and Gabriel went with Helen to visit the new exhibition being set up, she explained, sitting in the armchair across from his desk. The silence that followed was comfortable, full of mutual understanding. Both knew that the process would be difficult, that they would have to relive painful memories, but they also understood it was necessary to complete the healing cycle they had initiated. I found this today, said Richard, opening a drawer and removing an old photograph. It was from the day of the orphanage's inauguration decades ago. Augustus Vance smiled at the camera, surrounded by children he intended to transform into his masterpieces. He truly believed he was doing something good, commented Lucy, studying the photo. That's the scariest part. That's why the Phoenix Cultural Center is so important, replied Richard, to show that there is a different way to nurture talents, to create opportunities. The sound of the elevator announced the arrival of the boys with Helen. Gabriel entered first, carrying a new set of drawings. Michael followed, animatedly discussing the possibilities for expanding the art gallery. Helen, as always, supervised, everything with her attentive and affectionate gaze. "Look what I made," exclaimed Gabriel, spreading his drawings over Richard's desk. They were portraits of the family, not just them, but also the other families that frequented the cultural center. Each drawing captured something special, a unique connection between the people portrayed. "And I developed a project to create more music rooms," added Michael, showing his own sketchbook. "Raphael said we need different spaces for different instruments." Helen smiled, observing how Richard and Lucy naturally drew closer to examine the boys' creations. Speaking of Raphael, he sent a message. "He'll be a little late. The students asked him to teach one more song." "He's flourishing as a teacher," commented Lucy, proud. "Who would have thought that shy boy would become so confident?" "We've all changed," replied Richard, his gaze traveling over each face in the room, "in ways we could never have imagined." Gabriel, who had approached the window, called everyone's attention. "Look, it's starting to rain." Indeed, a gentle rain was beginning to fall over the city, very similar to the one that had united their lives just over a year ago. But now, instead of separation and fear, the rain brought a sense of renewal and possibility. "You know what this reminds me of?" asked Helen, heading to the kitchen. "I think it's a good night for hot chocolate." While Helen prepared the drink, the sound of the elevator announced Raphael's arrival. He entered the room with his book of scores, his face illuminated by the enthusiasm of another day of teaching. "How was the class, Professor?" joked Richard. "Amazing," replied Raphael, sitting at the piano. "Today one of the students managed to play an entire song by herself for the first time. You should have seen her smile." His hands began to stroke the keys softly, creating a melody that seemed to perfectly match the sound of the rain outside. Michael and Gabriel joined their brother, each bringing their own projects and dreams to share. Richard observed the scene with Lucy at his side, their hands naturally intertwined. Helen returned with the hot chocolate, distributing the cups with the loving efficiency that characterized her. "Tomorrow will be a big day," said Lucy softly, referring to the beginning of the judicial process. "Yes," agreed Richard, "but we're no longer alone." Raphael's music filled the room, mixing with the sound of the rain, with the boys' animated conversations, with the clinking of hot chocolate cups. It was a symphony of family, of love, of new beginnings, living proof that sometimes the greatest blessings can come disguised as challenges, and that true power lies not in control, but in the ability to open oneself to the unexpected. The New York Court of Justice imposed a solemnity that made one's heart tighten. Richard adjusted his tie while waiting in the corridor, beside Lucy and other former participants of Project Prometheus. Each of them carried their own story of overcoming, about to be revealed to transform the future of other children. Helen had stayed at the penthouse with the triplets, although Raphael had insisted on composing a special piece for the day. "To give courage," he had said, handing the score to Richard that morning. The notes, written in his childish but precise handwriting, were now folded in his jacket pocket, like a talisman. "Mr. Vance has already arrived," informed one of the lawyers, approaching the group. "Are you ready to begin?" Lucy held Richard's hand, a gesture that had become natural in recent months. "Together?" she asked. "Always," he replied, feeling the paper with Raphael's music in his pocket. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, lawyers, human rights organization representatives, and, most significantly, several of the former orphans from the project occupied the available seats. In front, Augustus Vance sat with his lawyers, his posture still proud despite the circumstances. When Richard was called to testify, the silence in the room was palpable. He walked to the stand, feeling the weight of decades of history on his shoulders. But instead of crushing him, this weight now strengthened him. "Please, Mr. Montgomery," began the judge, Tell us about your experience in Project Prometheus. Richard took a deep breath, his hands lightly touching the paper in his pocket. I was 9 when I was selected, he began. At the time, it seemed like a miracle. A powerful and respected man had chosen me, saying I had extraordinary potential. His eyes met Augustus's for a moment. The old businessman maintained his impassive expression, but something in his gaze had changed. What we didn't understand, continued Richard, was the price of this miracle. We were separated from any possibility of real emotional connection. Our talents weren't nurtured, they were exploited. We weren't children, we were investments. A murmur ran through the room. Some of the other former orphans nodded, recognizing their own story in Richard's words. But the worst wasn't the intensive training, the constant testing, or even the isolation, he continued. The worst was the subliminal message we received, that our value was only in our utility, that love and connection were weaknesses, that success meant solitude. Lucy, seated in the first row, had tears in her eyes. She more than anyone understood the impact of these words, having seen Richard's transformation in recent months. The project did shape us, yes, admitted Richard. It made us exceptionally successful in our fields. I built a business empire. Clara became a renowned scientist. John is an internationally acclaimed musician. But at what cost? He paused, removing the score from his pocket. This morning I received this from Raphael, a 5-year-old boy who has taught me more about music, love, and courage than all the years of training in the project. Augustus shifted in his chair, his gaze fixed on the paper Richard held. What Project Prometheus didn't understand, continued Richard, is that true excellence doesn't come from isolation, but from connection. Not from manipulation, but from the freedom to discover who we really are. He then related in detail how the project worked, how children were selected, how their talents were identified and exploited. He spoke about the methods of emotional control, about the constant pressure, about the fear of failure that haunted them. But he also spoke about redemption, about the Phoenix Cultural Center and how it was helping other children develop their talents naturally, with emotional support and respect for their individuality. What I ask this court, he concluded, is not just justice for the past, but protection for the future, so that no other child is treated as an experiment, so that no talent is developed at the expense of the soul. When he finished his testimony, the silence in the room was different from the initial one. It was no longer tense or apprehensive, but laden with understanding and possibility. As he returned to his seat, Richard passed by Augustus. The old businessman looked at him with a complex expression. There was still pride there, but now mixed with something that seemed like regret. "You were always the best of them," whispered Augustus, almost inaudibly, "but not in the way I expected." Richard stopped for a moment. "No," he replied softly. "I'm better in the way I chose to be." Lucy would be the next to testify, and as she prepared, Richard unfolded Raphael's score. The melody in his mind mingled with the voices in the room, with the sound of truth finally being revealed, with the whisper of a different future taking shape on the horizon. The sun was setting over New York, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. When the family returned to the penthouse after the last day of the trial, Helen awaited them with the Triplets, who had transformed the living room into a small celebration stage with drawings, posters, and, of course, music. "So it's over?" asked Raphael, seated at the piano, his small hands ready to play. "Yes, my love," replied Lucy, embracing her son. "It's over." The sentence had been clear. Augustus Vance and all those involved in Project Prometheus would face the legal consequences of their actions. More importantly, all resources and properties related to the project would be converted into a fund to support the work of the Phoenix Cultural Center and similar initiatives. "It's not really an end," corrected Richard, loosening his tie. "It's more of a new beginning." Michael and Gabriel ran to show what they had prepared during the day, a series of drawings and models representing their visions for the future of the cultural center. There were plans for new spaces, expanded programs, more ways to reach children with special talents. "Look at this," said Helen, bringing a tray with hot chocolate. a tradition that had become a symbol of important moments in the family. "It seems like just yesterday that you first arrived here." Raphael began to play softly, a melody that seemed to interweave all the stories they had lived through until now. The notes flowed like memories, the rainy morning of the first encounter, the discoveries about the past, the moments of fear and courage, the small daily victories, the shared smiles. "Is this music new?" asked Richard, approaching the piano. "I'm calling it family," replied Raphael without stopping playing, "because it has parts for all of us." And it truly did. There were strong, determined passages that reminded one of Richard, soft and welcoming parts that brought Lucy to mind, animated variations that captured Gabriel's energy, structured sections that reflected Michael's precision, and background harmonies that echoed Helen's constant presence. "You know," said Lucy, sitting next to Richard, "when I got into that car that morning, I was desperate for shelter. I didn't imagine I would find a home." Richard smiled, observing how his children, because that's how he saw them now, filled the environment with their unique and complementary personalities. "I also didn't imagine that, trying to give shelter to you, I would find my own liberation." Helen served the hot chocolate, and everyone settled in to listen to Raphael play. Michael explained his new architectural projects, while Gabriel showed the sketches for his next exhibition. The scene was so natural, so perfectly imperfect, that it seemed difficult to remember how their lives were before. "What happens now?" asked Gabriel, nestling between Richard and Lucy. "Now," replied Richard, "we continue writing our story. Together." Raphael ended his music with a soft chord that hung in the air like a promise. Outside, the city was beginning to light up, thousands of bright points in the growing darkness. But there, in that penthouse that had been transformed into a true home, shone a different light, the light of love, of understanding, of the family they had built. "You know," said Helen, collecting the empty cups, "they say the best families aren't formed just by blood, but by love and choice." Michael, always the most reflective, added, "Like an orchestra, right? Each one plays a different instrument, but together we make music." Richard felt Lucy squeeze his hand gently, while Raphael began a new melody at the piano. Gabriel was already drawing again, and Michael was leafing through his project notebook. Helen smiled, observing the scene with her maternal gaze. It was a very different image from that rainy morning a year ago, a lonely businessman in his luxurious car, a desperate mother protecting her children from the rain. Destiny, in its mysterious wisdom, had intertwined their lives in a way that none of them could have predicted. And there, on that special night, as Raphael's music echoed through the walls of the penthouse, everyone